Good evening. I'm Arthur Carter, Assistant Professor of New Testament here at Phillips Theological Seminary, and I welcome you to this community lecture. Tonight we have the Reverend Melanie Jones Quarles, who is a womanist ethicist, millennial preacher, and intellectual activist. Dr. Jones Quarles is an Assistant Professor of Ethics, Theology, and Culture, and the inaugural Director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Formerly, Dr. Jones Quarles served as the first Crump visiting professor and Black religious scholar in residence at Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas, and lecturer at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas, American Baptist College in Nashville, Tennessee, Chicago Theological Seminary, and the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, Illinois. Melanie is a thinking woman of faith, embodying radical love and revolutionary justice in the academy, church, and global community. She earned a BA in economics and political science from Howard University, the real HU, a Master of Divinity with a certificate in Black Church Studies from Vanderbilt University, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Ethics, Theology, and Culture with a concentration in Black faith and life at Chicago Theological Seminary. Her research engages womanist theological ethics and sacred texts, millennials and faith, Black aesthetics and digital technocultures, earning several notable fellowships and scholarships, including the Ph.D., the Louisville Institute, the Wabash Center, Villanova University Center for Church Management, Lilly Endowment, the Henry Luce Foundation, Innovation and Digital Engagement Lab. Her first academic monograph was recently published, Up Against a Crooked Gospel, Black Women's Bodies and the Politics of Redemption, which is now available via your local booksellers, published by Orbis Press. Melanie Jones Quarles is a leading voice, an amazing voice, a prophetic voice in theological religious education, and we're just so happy and thankful that she preached our first chapel service for this month, and even though it was virtual, she tore up the place. And now she's here to bring some fire and just a word for us to feast on. I thank you, I welcome you, and I'm humbly ready to learn from you. Can we all give a round of applause for the Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good evening, and first, just thank you, Arthur, for that wonderful introduction and for the opportunity to be here in this space with you in person, physically. It is certainly a pleasure and a delight. So my work, I first want to... I first want to give honor to President Dr. Poe for this invitation as well, and to thank you for this opportunity as well. And for all of you who've gathered tonight, I do not take it lightly to get a few moments of your time to talk about my continuing work in response to and connected to particularly my work up against the crooked gospel, Black women's bodies, and the politics of redemption. From that work, folks often ask me the question, if we understand what crooked gospels are as it relates to the experiences of Black women who often find themselves in peculiar situations that have been marked by multidimensional oppression, both in religion and society, where might we turn for a gospel that is liberative, that is liberating? And often my first point of entry is the color purple in particular, and what it offers us in terms of a vision for understanding not only Black women's experiences, but also Black life. So I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to you who are here in person, but also Phillips community who have gathered tonight, also online. Thank you for joining us. I like to begin with exactly where Alice Walker opens up The Color Purple. You better not never tell nobody but God. It'd kill your mammy. Dear God, I am 14 years old. I have always been a good girl. Maybe you can give me a sign letting me know what is happening to me. The opening lines of the novel bring the reader right into the center of Seeley's world, of a 14-year-old girl facing sexual violation by Pa, her presumed father, who seeks to silence her resistance by insisting that she talk to nobody but God. Readers discover later that Pa rapes her, impregnates young Seeley twice, takes both babies, Adam and Olivia, away from her, leaving her with the tormenting belief that her two children have been killed and are dead. While most would associate this painstaking reality with the climax of a literary tragedy, novelist Alice Walker places readers squarely within the death-dealing odds of a Black woman's world from the very beginning. By speaking her truth, if at first only to herself, then to God, and finally to her sister, Seeley begins the ultimate journey to self. The Color Purple, many of you are aware, is a story about a poor Black Southern woman, Seeley, who endures the tragic realities of rape, violence, and abuse that seek to suck the life out of her, but ultimately discovers her sense of self and reclaims her voice through love and sisterhood that heals, restores, and lifts her towards wholeness and wellness. This lecture, entitled Dear God, I'm Here, the Gospel According to the Color Purple, utilizes the characters of this cultural classic, the critical controversies surrounding these works, and constructive womanist God talk to engage the theopolitics of redemption for Black women. For many who may not know, The Color Purple originally entered the world as a novel written by the brilliant writer Alice Walker in 1982, which earned the 1983 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, making Walker the first Black woman to win a Pulitzer and the National Book Award. To date, the novel has sold more than 5 million copies and has been translated in more than 24 languages. In 1985, Steven Spielberg adapted the book for the classic film, which featured the score of Quincy Jones and the brilliant cast of Whoopi Goldberg as Seeley, Oprah Winfrey as Sophia, Danny Glover as Mr., Margaret Avery as Shug Avery, and Adolph Caesar as Old Mr. The film then generated approximately $142 million in box office sales and earned 11 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture. 20 years later, in 2005, The Color Purple musical, produced by Scott Sanders, Quincy Jones, and Oprah Winfrey, with music and lyrics by Brenda Russell, Allie Willis, and Stephen Bray, and the book by Marsha Norman, premiered on Broadway for 3 years, earning 11 Tony Award nominations and featuring accomplished actors and vocalists, including the 2004 American Idol winner Fantasia Barrino as Seeley. In 2015, Oprah revived the Color Purple musical on Broadway with Jennifer Hudson as Shug, Danielle Brooks as Sophia, and Cynthia Erivo as Seeley, earning the 2016 Tony Award for Best Actress in a Musical, and The Color Purple claiming the 2016 Tony title as the best revival of a musical. For more than a year, Winfrey promoted the making of a movie of The Color Purple musical as a bold new take on a beloved classic. And on Christmas Day in 2023, it was recognized as the second biggest Christmas Day opening of all time. The film adaptation of the musical and book directed by Blitz Bazul and adapted for the screen by poet and playwright Marcus Gartley and produced by Oprah Winfrey, Steven Spielberg again, executive produced by Alice Walker and Rebecca Walker, her daughter, was released in theaters featuring the star-studded cast of, again, Fantasia as Celie, Danielle Brooks as Sophia, Taraji P. Henson as Suge Avery, Gabriella Sarmiento Wilson, also known as her, as Squeak Mary Agnes, Holly Bailey as young Nettie, Sierra Wilson as adult Nettie, and a number of gifted musicians and entertainers, including Felicia Pearl Mapasi, Tamla Mann, David Allen Greer, Corey Hawkins, and countless others. Though snubbed from several honors, the breakout star Danielle Brooks received an Academy Award nomination for the Best Supporting Actress in the 2023 rendition. Though The Color Purple novel and original film arrived on the scene years before I was born, I would first come to learn of the story from the cultural lessons and retellings of the 1985 movie scenes that have made an imprint on Black popular culture since its arrival. The hand clapping of Celie and Nettie as children, this me and you, us never part, me and you, us have one heart, ain't no ocean, ain't no sea, keep my sister away from me, reveals the innocence of Black girls that is often stripped away, always too soon by a hostile world. Or the screaming in the fields, you told Harpo to be encouraging Sophia's husband to tame Sophia's willfulness by beating her, that results in Sophia leaving her pole. In the words of Sophia, all my life I had to fight. I had to fight my daddy. I had to fight my brother, cousins, and my uncles. A girl child ain't safe in a family of men, but I never thought I'd have to fight in my own house. I love Harpo, she said. God knows I do, but I'll kill him dead before I let him beat me. Here we learn struggles between women and men under the rule of pernicious patriarchy that aims to subdue women, often to raise the ego of men. Or maybe you are familiar with the emphatic hell no from Miss Sophia, when Miss Millie, a white woman, original Karen, sees Sophia and her children as clean and respectable and otherwise suitable to leverage her white privilege to exploit Sophia as her maid. No problem. No problem. Yeah. No problem. Can y'all hear me? Awesome. So maybe you remember this scene, the emphatic hell no from Miss Sophia, when Miss Millie, a white woman, the original Karen, sees Sophia and her children as clean and respectable and otherwise suitable to leverage her white privilege to exploit Sophia as her maid. When Sophia refuses and strikes back, she lands in jail for 6 to 12 years, only to be released by the goodness of Miss Millie, allowing her to be her maid as the only freedom. An all too popular scene of white women's tears and Black women's terrors. Or perhaps you remember when Celie rises from the dinner table, willing all of her power back from years of abuse, with a knife to Mister's neck, exclaiming, "Until you do right by me, everything you think about is going to crumble." To which Mister replies, "Look at you. You are Black, you are poor, you are ugly, you are a woman, you are nothing at all. and the infamous two-finger pointing of Seeley to Mr. when leaving with Shug to go to Memphis. Everything you done to me, she says, already done to you. I'm poor, I'm black, I may even be ugly, but dear God, I'm here. I'm here. A reminder to all of us that whatever has been done to you, there is still something of God left in you to never lay down to violation or violence, but ultimately to resist and to fight back. I remember vividly that first trip to the city of New York to see the acclaimed Color Purple musical on Broadway at its height. Of many firsts, then it was my first time in New York, my first show on Broadway, my first time seeing the musical as a college student, and it lit my soul on fire and led me back to the novel itself. In divinity school, I fell in love with the novel as a womanist canon, a womanish Bible of sorts, hanging on to the wisdom and ingenuity of its every word, highlighting and outlining it as a sacred text from cover to cover. Now, as a professor, I teach the Color Purple semester after semester. It is a primary reading in a number of my classes, including womanist literature and theological imagination, making connections to contemporary struggles and introducing most students to its brilliance and the theological wisdom of African diasporan women's writings, often for the very first time. From New York to Texas to D.C., every time the Color Purple is featured on or off Broadway, I make my way to witness its glory, often with students, colleagues, and relatives in tow. Once after leaving the theater, a colleague and sister friend responded to the recent rendition this way: "The Color Purple, the canon," she called it, is a reminder of how powerful our lives are, our stories. Our story will always be for us, our journey to live out, a work that is done through us, a transformation and revival, and a revelation for someone else, a testimony, hope, healing, a mirror, and a means of helping someone else through their journey. The Color Purple is a timeless classic, a story that invites reflection about the struggles of life. If not through the impregnated by her stepfather twice and abused by a husband who never wanted her Seeley, then maybe you can resonate with a woman with a beautiful mind, the educated globe-trotting sister Nettie fending off unwanted sexual advances at every turn. Or the infamous Shug Avery, who is guilty of one thing: being free. Or the fiery Sophia, whose audaciousness was always a problem from the moment she was born. Or the dreamer called Squeak, who reclaims her name and identity, Mary Agnes, despite the labels placed upon her. Or even the stories of the menfolk: Pa Alfonso, who suffers from always taking, never giving; the fill-in-the-blank Mr. period; Albert, whose toxicity has infected everyone and everything he encounters; the grumpy old Mr., who is stuck in the harrowing cycle of conflating the way things used to be as the way things are supposed to be; the redefining himself Harpo, who is trying to find a new way with often only old tools in front of him; the self-righteous Reverend Shug's Pa, who would forsake his own child simply because they chose a different path from the one he charted for her; or even the displaced children of Olivia and Adam, robbed of the love of their biological mother at a young age. There is something in these characters that many of us can find connections to our own unique stories and lives. All we have is our story. The power emerges when we tell our stories that give others a glimpse of our journey and an opportunity to learn the lessons that help us survive and thrive regardless. This power of storytelling, or naming ourselves for ourselves, inspired Alice Walker to extract from Southern Black idiomatic expression "you actin' womanish" the term womanist,
as a means to name the distinctive political aims of black women beyond the white feminist scope of the 1980s. For Walker, a womanist is to feminists as purple is to lavender. Black women theologians, namely Katie Cannon, Jacqueline Grant, and Dolores Williams, birthed womanist theology in the 1980s as a prophetic social movement and theology of liberation, affirming the full humanity of black women as made in the image of God, while also confronting both the missing analysis of gender in black theology, struggle for black liberation and race, and the missing perspective of race in white feminist theologies rally against patriarchy. Womanist theological ethics explores literature as a sacred text, or perhaps a spiritual pathway equipped with words that open our mystical worlds like portals that connect us to the stories, testimonies, and memories of that great cloud of ancestral witnesses who bear the scars of the past and healing salve for the present and the future. I am particularly attuned to the power of literature when the banning of books is still a topic of discussion and contention, as black women's literature like The Color Purple by Alice Walker and stories written by other voices representing communities who are systemically excluded are on the chopping block of whether they should be taught in schools because they explore critical questions of race, critical race theory, and gender and sexuality studies that address facets of living human experience. The Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, known to many as the first black woman ordained in the Presbyterian Church, and the former Annie Scales Rogers Professor of Christian Ethics at Union Presbyterian Seminary, was the first to source Walker's term womanist in the Theological Academy and opened the field of Christian ethics by introducing black women's literature as a source and resource for the doing of womanist theological ethics. In addition to spiritual autobiography and religious writings, Cannon identified literature as a locus for unearthing the sacred canopy of lived experience. She says, quote, "When I first began teaching at New York Theological Seminary in 1977, there were no books by black women theologians. In her early teaching years of the 70s and 80s, Cannon used novels, prose, poetry, short stories, biomythographies, then added in nonfiction, biographies, and essays to discern black women's God talk until the catalog grew wider." Cannon writes, quote, "The work of black women writers can be trusted as seriously mirroring black reality. Their writings are chronicles of black survival. In their plots, actions, and depictions of characters, black women writers flesh out the positive attributes of black folk who are often hidden beneath the ordinariness of life. They know how to lift the imagination as they inform, how to touch the emotions as they record, how to delineate specifics so that they are applicable to oppressed humanity everywhere. In essence, there is no better source for comprehending the real lived texture of black experience and the meaning of the moral life in the black context than the black women's literary tradition. Black women's literature offers the sharpest available view of the black community soul," end quote. Like Cannon in 1977, I too enter classrooms of seminary students in 2025 who have never read a book by an African-descended woman and have never encountered a black woman preaching in their churches or even sometimes teaching in their schools. Cannon understands that the black women's literary tradition then is the best available repository for understanding the ethical values black women have created and cultivated in this society. Hence, it is still necessary for religious scholars and practitioners to continue to mine the motherlode of Black women's literature in a quest to debunk, unmask, and disentangle oppressive ideologies, theologies, and systems, and employ valuable acts to dispel the threat of death in order to seize the present life. The Color Purple has received its share of criticism, scrutiny, censorship, and controversy over the last 40 years, both being banned by the American Library Association on and off since 1990, dismissed for its African Southern vernacular, blacklisted for its exposing of the taboo subject of incest, attacked for its truth-telling of the tragedy of toxic Black masculinity, and shunned because of its exploration of women loving other women freely. Before the novel's release, Alice Walker submitted the early manuscript to Essence magazine, known to many as the Black Women's Lifestyle Guide, but the editor of the time opted out of promoting The Color Purple because of Seeley's speech, scoffing, "Black people don't talk like that." Writer and author of Mumbo Jumbo, Ishmael Reed, wrongly accused the novel of advancing a feminist agenda to narrate Black men as rapists. His 1986 novel, Reckless Eyeballing, represents a satirical attempt to depict Walker as a character who receives acclaim for writing the book Wrong-Headed Man, a play about a Black man who goes around raping and assaulting women. The controversy only grew louder as the work blossomed. By the 1985 release of the film, an activist group named the Coalition Against Black Exploitation formed solely to disparage The Color Purple and discourage the adoption of the film as a household name. Not only did the film receive critique, but Walker herself fell victim to scathing assaults against her artistry, her perspective, and her voice. According to In Search of the Color Purple, the story of an American masterpiece, Pulitzer Prize-winning literary critic Salamisha Tillett cites the late Rudolph Byrd, a professor of African American Studies at Emory College and founding co-chair of the Alice Walker Literary Society, who confessed, quote, "No writer in the 20th century was attacked in the sustained and virulent way that Alice was around this novel. No writer, none." Tillett records Black feminist Spelman College professors' direct words: "Alice was the most hated Black woman in America ever," at the release of the movie. Though Walker had worked for the feminist publication Ms. Magazine years before the novel, Walker was slammed for her 1982 cover feature as both Black men and Black women were suspicious of her networks and ties to leading white feminist voices like Gloria Steinem. And the controversy continues. Feminists and womanist scholars have long argued women's bodies as battlefields where the normalization of gender-based violence exists in global contexts. Perhaps this is characteristic of ways some moviegoers who engaged the recent musical adaptation of The Color Purple left theaters appalled by Seeley and Shug's lesbian sexuality and not the brutal rape and assaults against Seeley, or the unwanted sexual advances against Nettie, or even the violent taming of Sophia's willfulness by male paternal figures or intimate lovers. In this case, gender-based violence causes little to no alarm. Only freedom raises suspicion and outright rejection of these characters and their stories. Though the 2023 film peaked in its first week, box office sales have steadily declined in the last few weeks, earning $59 million over its last 30 days in theaters for a movie that cost close to $100 million. Many attributed this to leading Lady Taraji P. Henson, who vocally spoke out against pay disparity, as well as the absence of food and other basic amenities for the cast while filming on set. Though Henson admits The Color Purple is not the first movie where she had to fight for her worth, critics slammed Henson for sharing her truth during the promotion of a classic with an all-black cast. In this sense, Henson playing Shug and owning her freedom in living color to speak her mind is another example of black women being told to silence their voice and betray their experiences, to numb up and dumb down, because essentially it is never the right time to hear a black woman's truth. Despite this controversy, The Color Purple has lived into the words of Katie Cannon. Even when they call your truth a lie, tell it anyway. Theological norming in Western constructions and the black church are often inimical to black women's interests. Unlike dominant Western theologies and traditional Christian ethics that makes claim for gender-neutral and value-free inquiry as a model for knowledge, womanist theological ethics seeks to interrogate these aims through the eyes of the least of these, and critique theological constructions that negate the wholeness or full existence of women who deal with the realities of social injustice and multi-layered oppressions. The theological question at stake is, what do womanists say about the God of their experiences given their oppressed realities? Womanist theoethical norming centers survival, liberation, and creative self-expression for black women. It is most evident here again in The Color Purple, whether from the jumping gospel medley of God is trying to tell you something. What remains evident in every single version and iteration of the masterpiece is its deep theological significance. It is as much a cultural classic as it is a spiritual one. The Color Purple is ripe with God talk. Many folks do not know that the novel itself is a series of letters, almost as a diary, addressing each letter with Dear God, where Celie tells her story and the stories of the characters. While most would identify its spiritual significance with the recurring Dear God, the book has received less attention as a theological work. Walker herself describes the book's intent to explore, quote, the difficult path of someone who starts out in life already a spiritual captive, but who, through her own courage and the help of others, breaks free into the realization that she, like nature itself, is a radiant expression of the heretofore perceived as quite distant divine. There is no question that the economic and political history of black people from slavery to freedom begs the question of whether a liberating God has concern for black women. Miss Celie, you better hush. God might hear you, Shug say. Let him hear me, I say. If God ever listened to poor colored women, the world would be a different place, I can tell you. In Celie's imagination, the Western archetype of God as big and old and tall and gray-bearded and white inhibits her from finding herself in God's image and care. Celie is not old, not big, not tall, nor gray or white, and for many outside of a narrow concept of being made in the image of God. Celie is young, poor, skinny, too skinny, and marked by her circumstances, thereby often deeming her as ugly. At first, God for Celie appears to be far and removed and unconcerned with the trouble facing Celie. Celie is writing to God, but is yet to receive a response in the letters from her long-lost sister Nettie, who we later find have been sent letters, but have been hidden by Mr. all along. There is a significant point in the novel when Celie writes, Dear Daddy, I don't write to God no more, I write to you. When Shug asks Celie why, it prompts new discovery for Celie about a God who is closer and more familiar. Perhaps the longest exchange Seeley has about God comes from one of the least likely characters by the name of Shug, a blues woman who lives out loud so much that she is outcasted by her judgmental pastor father. Cultural critic Danielle Young makes it clear. Shug represented a woman who was a departure from the women of the first half of the 20th century. She was stubborn, reckless, firm, selfish, honest, loud, lusty, and likely the most free-spirited woman of her time. She was admired by women and men alike, not only because of the glitz and glamour she put on full display in elaborate red sequin dress and feathery heather pieces. Shug was the freedom that most women of that time wouldn't have even dared to dream of. Shug was a free black woman at a time that didn't allow for women any freedoms. Much like the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the least likely become the mouthpieces of good news. Walker draws us into this irony that Shug, the blues woman who appears to be estranged, knows more about God than the holy rollers who claim to be so godly. Seeley, tell the truth. Have you ever found God in church? I never did. I just found a bunch of folks hoping for him to show. Any God I ever felt in church, I brought in with me. And I think all the other folks did too. They come to church to share God, not find God. For Shug, church is the place to bring and share God that emphasizes the presence of the divine in all of us. Shug moves Seeley to a new sense of admiration for God and for God's creation. Listen, God loves everything you love and a mess of stuff you don't. But more than anything else, God loves admiration. You saying God vain, I ask? No, she say. Not vain, just wanting to share good thing. I think it pisses God off. If you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it, what it do when it pissed off, I ask? Oh, it made something else. People think pleasing God is all God care about, but any fool living in the world can see it is God always trying to please us back. Shug is the one who helps Seeley to learn that God is spirit, present and existing in everything. Here's the thing, says Shug, the thing I believe, God is inside you and inside everybody else. You come into the world with God, but only them that search for it find it. And sometimes it just manifests itself even if you're not looking or don't know what you're looking for. Walker admits that the color purple is a theological work examining the journey from the religious back to the spiritual that even she spent much of her adult life trying to avoid. Seeley embodies the lesson that Walker intends to teach all of us. No one is exempt from the possibility of a conscious connection to all that is. Not the poor, not the suffering, not the rider sitting in an open field. It is this awakening of the divine that helps Seeley to find a renewed sense of self, an evolved consciousness, and a love for the God inside of her. It is this watershed moment for Seeley, much like what writer Ntozake Shange's character in For Color Girls described as, I found God in myself and I loved her fiercely. It is the moment of awareness that Seeley sings the song, I'm Here. I believe I have inside of me everything that I need to live a bountiful life. With all the love inside of me, I stand as the tallest tree. And I'm thankful for each day that I'm giving, both the easy and the hard ones I'm living. But most of all, I'm thankful for loving who I really am. I'm beautiful. Yes, I'm beautiful, and I'm here. Seeley understands who she is, good creation, beautiful, full of love, and possessing something of God inside. Thus, the color purple is significant, being both the color of royalty, majesty, as well as the color of pain, bearing witness to the scars of life that bruise and burden us. The color purple, as Alice Walker described it, is always a surprise, but it is everywhere. Like the color, the story illuminates both sorrow and salvation. Redemption is present when Seeley learns that Al is her stepfather and her real father left her name on the deed of what he owned. According to womanist theologian Dolores Williams, Shug and Seeley give us a larger vision of redemption. That message is that women's liberation also leads to men's redemption. Seeley's new self-affirming independence causes the redemption of her husband, Mr., who in the past brutalized Seeley near the end of the book. But Walker shows that her salvation has also necessitated a change in his consciousness. In a positive sense, he has changed his mind about male-female relationships, about love and sexuality. And in the musical and the movie, it is Albert who once separated the sisters that now fosters the reconciliation between the Seeley, Nettie, and her children, Olivia and Adam. In the final letter of the novel and reprise of the musical, Seeley writes, "Dear God, dear stars, dear trees, dear sky, dear people, dear everything, dear God, God is inside me and everything else that was or ever will be. I came into this world with God, and finally, when I looked inside, I found it just as close as my breath is to me, from the plate of corn to the honeybee to the waterfall, all a part of me, like the color purple. Where do it come from? Now my eyes are open. Look what God has done." Seeley arrives at a place of finding herself alongside all creation as belonging to God's royal family and radiating the splendor of God's handiwork, making her now fully in awe of what God has done. What then is the gospel according to the color purple? Perhaps Walker invites us to listen to the voices of the least likely. We all need a Shug in our lives, a mix of fire and desire, fiery red and stillness blue that makes purple and draws us toward our salvation by asking heretofore undreamed and unfamiliar questions of every aspect of theological traditions to which we are heirs. Womanists, feminists, and mujerista scholars, we too play a significant role in authorizing God talk. Perhaps some are looking for God out there, but Walker invites us also to think about finding God in the familiar. Womanist ethicist Emily Towns, in her work Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil, argues the way to challenge the forces of evil, both the evil waged upon us and the evil of our own making, is to live our faith deeply in the everydayness of our moral actions. Our grand gestures of righteous indignation and action matter little if we have not attended to the way we live every day. The everydayness of listening closely when folks talk or don't talk to hear what they are saying, of taking time, however short and long, to refresh ourselves, of being a presence in people's lives, of speaking to folks and actually meaning whatever it is that is coming out of our mouth, of sharing a meal, of facing heartache and disappointment, joy and laughter, of facing people who expect us to lead them somewhere or at least point them in the right direction and walk with them, the everydayness of blending head and heart, of giving up and trying one more time every day to get our living right. Last, Walker invites us to cultivate a sense of wonder. Cole Arthur Riley writes in This Here Flesh, "Wonder requires a person not to forget themselves, but to feel themselves so acutely that their connectedness to every created thing comes into focus." Seeley's life was more than a grotesque collection of traumas. She learned the language of wonder. And allowing for this all in her did not diminish the pain of her story. It simply made her more human. Dear God, I'm here may mean something different for all of us. For those of us who crawled our way, hanging by a thread, to look back at everything that tried to kill us, to put two fingers up and turn back to an ugly world. I may be broken, bent over, but dear God, I'm here. And for others, dear God, I'm here may point us to a renewed sense of self-worth that is aware of who you are and what you have been given. This is the glory moment when when Celie sings in the musical, I'm going to hold my head up. I'm going to put my shoulders back. When they walk by, I'm going to sing out. And I'm thankful for each day I'm given. But most of all, I'm thankful for loving who I really am. I'm beautiful. I'm beautiful, and I'm here. Perhaps the ultimate aim for the color purple is that, like Celie, all of us will recognize that God is inside you and everybody else. Find a renewed sense of self that recognizes the interdependence of humanity with the whole of creation, and that no matter the tumultuous journey, that no one is too far from redemption, but all will one day be in awe of what God has done. From the plate of corn to the honeybee, to the waterfall, all a part of me. Like the color purple, demonstrating the wonder of God. Where does it come from? Now our eyes are open. Look what God has done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that stimulating lecture. And I also am inviting anyone that's online on YouTube. Please, you are able to submit any questions that you have in the chat on YouTube, and we will try to get them to our speaker. Likewise, here in the chapel, Ulysses has a pen and pad. If you have any questions, please jot those down, and we'll get them to me so we can present them to our guest speaker. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for that lecture. And I will take the prerogative to ask an initial question. Could you tell us a little bit about the role that the color purple and as a scriptural text for you, with respect also to Up Against the Crooked Gospel, like how, for those that haven't been able to engage it and so forth, would you just talk to us a little bit about your engagement with the color purple as a scholar and how it shows up and how it has progressed in Up Against the Crooked Gospel?
Yeah. So part of what Up Against the Crooked Gospel, the full title is Black Women's Bodies and the Politics of Redemption. It was in Religion and Society, but my editor cut it. But the Politics of Redemption speaks to the challenges that Black women face as it relates to the multidimensionality of oppression that shows up in terms of crooked manifestations that often shift or twist Black women's virtues to vices, right? So these kind of narratives that often suggest that the posture or the decisions that Black women make are often seen as immoral, right? And this is to speak against that, to say, no, actually their actions, their decisions is actually virtuous. And they are up against gospel or traditions that often manifest crooked manifestations about how they should be, how they should exist in the world and in the church. And they have to contort their experiences and their lives to fit these distortions. The book draws from the notion from Melissa Harris Perry's work in Sister Citizen about how often Black women exist in a crooked room and they have to tilt themselves in order to exist or live as right-sided up. And this kind of metaphor, in many ways, opens us up to this is not something that's happening philosophically, psychologically. Harris Perry traces this in terms of politically, but I argue that this is happening in our religious spaces. Whenever there are realities by which Black women exist as the majority population in the church, but they're the least likely to hold spaces or capacities of leadership in that church, something is crooked about that paradigm, right? Whenever they're the folks who have often been not only in terms of presence, but also in terms of maintaining the systems of the institutions of churches, and then they are not a part of the envisioning or the visions of Black liberation, then there's something crooked about that manifestation, right? So if these crooked gospels exist, right, in terms of the experiences that we see in society, in politics, I trace that, but also specifically in the church, what manifestations or gospel exists that we can extract from Black women's traditions. And this is where I turn to The Color Purple to say, oh, there is some gospel truth to what Walker is presenting for us in The Color Purple that we might extract for ourselves. Listen to the least likely, right? Find God in the familiar. Not just God is not existing far away from us, but God is right and near and present with us. And also returning rather than being distracted by these multidimensional oppressions that keep us. Toni Morrison says racism distracts us. It overwhelms us. But if we cultivate our sense of wonder and press in towards these technologies of survival like wonder and imagination, like play and dream, then perhaps we'll be able to enliven a gospel that is more familiar to Black women.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture. I am wondering your thoughts and reflections on why Black theologians haven't engaged Walker sort of as deeply, given it's such a sort of rich resource for theology. But it seems like it's almost like, well, the wominists do that, so hands off. So what is your thinking of why African American or Black theologians haven't engaged it? Because it feels like that would be a good intersection for a rich conversation between the two.
Yeah, I think part of, I would say, some challenges to engagement for Black, particularly Black male liberation theologians, has been connected to the ways that Walker explicitly confronts toxic masculinity and does not let down in the ways that it manifests, and multiple, from intimate partners to also ways that it manifests in terms of generationally. And unwillingness to confront that as a reality, I think, might be a part of that. But I think, as I try to articulate, that's not the whole of the novel. That's not the whole of the story. And part of what Walker reveals to us, I mean, Mr. starts out with no name, this kind of nameless figure, and it is into the end, right, that Albert becomes the very reconciling figure. So there is possibility of redemption, but it requires a change, a transformation, right? And so in that sense, I think giving up some of the ways by which there is power and privilege that does not cast, in terms of Black liberation theology, that has not casted a large enough vision of Black liberation for all of us, right? There's some way in which Walker confronts that, and I think some hesitation to deal with that head on might be one of the reasons why. And often when I talk about The Color Purple, people are like, oh, we know about The Color Purple. I'm like, you don't really, right? Because you've been really forced this kind of deep engagement with what she's articulating, and we brush past the stories, either somewhat taken back because they're so traumatic, right? They're so challenging. It's harsh realities. We're getting confronted with someone being sexually violated, someone being tragically, the realities of incest and other things that hit you at the first page, right? At the first part of the narrative. And so it often is something that folks turn away from because we don't want to jump or delve deeply into those realities. Much like I tell my students, we have to engage these realities because they are part of the human experience. And our own negotiations about unwillingness to confront these realities is somewhat disingenuous to the realities that many of us face. And this is somebody's story. And if not our own, perhaps we understand how to engage these stories as we think about our own relationships to ministry and support of others. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions. How do you see the theological teachings from The Color Purple coming out in the academy and perhaps out in the church? You are an ordained minister, And so, can you talk a little bit about the integration of, the scripturalization of the color purple and affirming and centering Black women's experiences and voices and stories in both fiction and nonfiction? How do you see it coming out in the academy and in the church, and do you have recommendations or suggestions?
Yeah, I think that first piece, when I talk about finding these least likely characters, and I turn back to the Gospels, right, and say all throughout these New Testament gospel narratives, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right, they tell us these stories about the least likely as prime candidates for being mouthpieces for the gospel, right? We can name this in particular, and this is directly related to my own work in terms of these women in particular who are not only first, right, to encounter a risen Savior, but they're also first to tell the story, right, and to tell others about this risen Christ. This is the spreading or the beginning of the spread of the gospel. Here, Walker parallels this, right? She utilizes Shug as the least likely, who shouldn't be the character that knows anything about God, but she gives us a window into perhaps the most thick kind of revelation of how we might think about God in a liberative way, right? And so this mirrors, I think, the gospel text in that sense. And it's an invitation, right, to us as religious folk, as people of faith, right, to kind of recognize as those voices who have been cast out, who are least among us, who are left out, because they might be the very vehicles to help us understand that which is truth-telling, wisdom-bearing, and justice-seeking. And if we forget those voices, then we will miss the gospel.
Thank you. I have another question from the audience. This is part mid-rash. I'm going with the question, but moderator's prerogative. So, being a truth teller is dangerous, and especially as a Black woman. Time and time again, we see it from Vice President Kamala Harris to Joy Reid and Alice Walker, as you discussed. Do you have any suggestions for how we navigate this in this current climate, and how do we help people to see that this is not just a Black women's issue, but a justice issue? And going along with this question, there's often a commodification of scholarship, a commodification of voices. And so Black women's voices are valuable as long as they can be consumed and marketed by X, Y, Z, right? And so, again, that's my add-on to the question, but what are your suggestions? How do you understand it? What are your suggestions for this? Keeping in mind this concern about the commodification of Black women's voices and so forth and so on.
Yeah, so it's so much there. I think if we go back to The Color Purple and we remember the encounter that Sophia has with Miss Millie, right? And she is rightfully, this woman is approaching her, touching on her children, trying to invade her space, and she rightfully responds and strikes back. But it lands her in jail for ultimately, we're not sure the length fully, but somewhere 6 to 12 years. Part of what I think it exposes for us, and I often talk about this in Christian ethics courses, is that one of the survival strategies, one of the ethical strategies that Black folks have utilized throughout the ages, one of those strategies is confrontation. With confrontation, there has been a kind of interest to agitate these systems, right? To respond, to face evil head on. Ida B. Wells Barnett is the person who comes to mind to expose, right, the terror of lynching. She says the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And even in that confrontation, they do not escape risk, right? And this is, this makes me also think about this sermon that I preached via the television, via the virtual, about Jesus, who risks, right, his own ministry and mission, his own life, in order to share, in order to spread this message, in order to spread this truth that is a radical social vision of liberation. So this is to say that yes, truth tellers bear the brunt of rough terrain, have to encounter realities that often square us up front with the face of evil. And yet, that does not absolve the risks that confrontation brings, right? It's kind of part of the job, right? And in recognition of that reality, this is where the community plays an important role, because all of us will engage in navigating this risk. And if we make space for some to come forward and some to be able to retreat at times and to rest, gives an opportunity that no one bears the struggle alone, right? I really appreciate in this moment, so many people have rallied around Joy Reid and said, MSNBC, protesting, not watching, or not supporting the network. This is the shared confrontation that makes one person not the one who becomes the salvific or surrogate for all of us, but helps us to actively be engaged in bearing the risk together. And so I don't think, as truth tellers, because this is confrontational work, we will encounter risks. What I do hope is that there is a community of care that is able to bear those burdens together. And then it makes the brunt of what we encounter not so challenging alone, because there is a community that also shares in this struggle.
I have a comment that I would like you to, I'll make a comment, and then I just would like to see if you have any thoughts or reflections on it. During your lecture, you talked about how the color purple has been scripture for you. And as a contextual biblical critic myself, it's vital that I teach my students that it's vital that they recognize their own ideological scriptures, because often we read the biblical text through hidden scriptures that we take advantage of, right? And so one of the beautiful things that I hear as you read the color purple as scripture is responds to questions about it being banned, about it being inappropriate, about all of these things, sexual violence, domestic violence, that the color purple is inappropriate, yet through reading the color purple, it highlights these experiences and voices. These are topics and motifs that are firmly in the Christian canon. Right? We're talking about Dinah, we're talking about Tamar, we're talking about, like, throughout the biblical canon, which is now being purchased by state taxpayers in the state of Oklahoma, and placed in our schools under the authority of the state Secretary of Education. Yet at the same time, the color purple is inappropriate. And so I'm just curious in what ways does leaning into your own scriptural understanding of the color purple as speaking voices, in what ways does it open your engagement, your reading? I know you talked about it a little bit, but I'm inviting you to go even further, to talk about how it opens up the perspectives and the ways that you can then see things that need to be critiqued or lifted up, or things that otherwise, through other lenses, through other privileges, we ignore in the actual Christian canon, right? So all of a sudden, reading through the color purple at some points is more appropriate and more accurate reading of the biblical text, right? Yeah. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I will. in doing research for Up Against the Crooked Gospel, one of the things that I often would do is take texts like The Color Purple and others into Bible studies with Black women in various churches. And there were many women who know The Color Purple or other popular writings, but they didn't want to have a conversation with me until I could tell them where we could have some parallel with the scriptural text, which opened me up to understand that Black women's literary tradition doesn't need to be a replacement of scriptural text. But there is opportunity for us to read these texts alongside each other. I draw on the work of Dolores Williams, who often talks about this as a hermeneutic of parallel. That if we are able to put The Color Purple right in conversation with a story like the story of Dinah or the story of Tamar, it's why in my own work I put the story of my own grandmother, my maternal grandmother, right as a woman who was bent over for the last 25 years of her life, right in conversation with Luke 13 and the narrative of the woman bent over for 18 years. These stories can see each other together and make it possible for us to mirror or read what is happening in these stories in ways that they show up in the scriptural text and ask questions of ourselves that may reflect a kind of cultural text that may have some resonance contemporarily, but also has some truth or universality that extends beyond our times that is present in the scriptural text. So part of what my invitation when I think about Black women's sacred texts is to invite us to find ways in which we might read these texts alongside each other and see some possibilities to explore. In fact, many of the Black women writers are already providing us with deep spiritual undertones in their writings that you don't have to run far. Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, it's named Parable of the Sower, right? The Color Purple, every other story is Dear God. I mean, the God talk is already there. It's about us finding the ways in order to see and read these texts together. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for our speaker? All right, one more comment and then I'm gonna let you all go. You've stimulated minds, you've brought it again. And would you just leave our viewers on YouTube and the people that are here, next works, other works, expand their library right now, right? So who else, as they're reading The Color Purple, who else would you recommend that they pick up? You can't list everyone, but we'll use this time just to expand the bibliography and library a little bit.
Yeah, so these are what I call Black women classics, right? So Color Purple is start there. I start also with Nella Larson's Quicksand. Folks might be mindful of Nella Larson. She also writes, and it's a movie on passing. That's a popular text. You have to read a work from Zora Neale Hurston. My favorite is Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I would add Toni Morrison. She is a number, but I often use Sula because she gives us some interesting relationships between Black women and their experiences there. And then Octavia Butler. If you haven't read anything from Octavia Butler in 2024, you need to read Octavia Butler. She is sci-fi fantasy writer, but has given us, literally there was last year, 2024, that is kind of one of the years that is significant in Parable of the Sower. But there were ways in which the year 2012 was just parallel with Octavia Butler's writings. And at points, I'm like, wait a minute, are we in the book or are we in real life here? So, that's how prophetic her work has been and continues to be. There's some new writers like N.K. Jemisin, Tananarive Due, her whole trilogy. She has a blood trilogy on Black immortals that is absolutely fascinating. But she's been doing a lot of work alongside Monica Coleman on what Octavia tried to tell us. So Tananarive Due and this narrative of Black women's horror writings. How Black women are never the final girl, or they always die early in most horror movies. Why is that? And how do we ensure that Black women are able to live through the horror? So we have some new, really amazing young Black horror writers who are out. So I could go on, but that's some place to start. And not just literature, poetry. Lucille Clifton. Oh my goodness. Maya Angelou, Nikki Giovanni, God rest her soul. These are voices that you should know.
You, Reverend.
Yeah.
May we all thank the Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles. We've really been enlightened. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate everyone that was able to come out here. We thank everyone on YouTube that was able to join us. This is from Phillips Theological Seminary. Have a blessed night.